Today we are going to be taking a look at the new 24 half pan set from Daniel Smith. I was super excited to hear that Daniel Smith was finally going to be releasing a proper watercolor palette in a metal tin rather than the plastic that they released last year. And then I was a little bit taken aback when my patrons let me know what the lineup was going to be because it looked really familiar. Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. My name is Denise, and if you're new around here, you might not know that last year I released my own 24 half pan set with Da Vinci. This watercolor palette is called the Earth-Friendly Da Vinci Watercolor Palette, and I spent months curating and researching different watercolor pigments to create a really good balance between a functional mixing palette and one that was sustainable or earth-friendly. If you do want to learn more about this palette, I'll go ahead and put a link up here so you can check out that video. It seems surreal a little less than a year later that Daniel Smith, which is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, watercolor company that I've used for the entirety of my watercolor journey, has borrowed some really heavy inspiration from my palette to create their latest lineup. I was trying to think whether or not it was a coincidence that these kind of lined up, but after taking a closer look, there are a lot of similarities. So today we're going to take a look at these two palettes side by side, see what's similar, what's different, and which one would be best for you. Before we get started swatching, let's take a quick look at the packaging this palette comes in. The box itself is the width of two metal tins, as there are in fact two palettes inside. It contains one set with 24 filled half pans and another set that has empty half pans. This is a pretty nice marketing strategy from Daniel Smith because who among us can't resist filling a lonely little empty palette, right? The box itself is high quality, marked with the Daniel Smith logo, and it has rolled edges on the inside. In comparison with the Da Vinci palette, I prefer the unique matte gray finish and the rounded mixing wells of my palette, but the Daniel Smith one earned some points by having more mixing wells on the opposite side, a total of 8 instead of 5. The Daniel Smith palette has white half pans, which are stamped with the company's name on the bottom, and the Da Vinci half pans are translucent and are not stamped. The walls of the Da Vinci half pans are thicker, which fills the entire row when using 12 of them in a standard tin, while Daniel Smith's standard pans leave a gap that is just a bit too small to squeeze a 13th pan in, though you might be able to squeeze a smaller Winsor Newton size pan in there, but I'm not entirely sure. Future post-editing Denise here. After finishing this video, I did want to check in with Da Vinci about the status of the tin so that I could keep you as up-to-date as possible. As many of you already know, with the new product launch last fall, all of the new sets, like the fill-in paint set and the smaller wildlife sets, come with a different tin than the one that I've been showing you here. My original Earth-Friendly palette has still been using the original darker tin. There is a limited supply left, and this half pan set specifically will ship with them until stock runs out, at which point they'll likely switch over to the new tins. The new tins function almost identically as the Daniel Smith one that we've been looking at in this video, with 8 smaller wells on the flatter side of the palette and the larger, less rounded wells on the other. The outside is a shiny, warm gray, which differs from both the matte palettes that we have been looking at in this video, but everything else remains the same, including the Da Vinci pans filling the rows edge to edge. I'll of course do my best to keep you updated moving forward about any changes with the palettes, but now, back to the video. If you'd like to see my first impressions on this palette, I did record a live stream for my patrons where we did the initial unboxing. The biggest thing that I wanted to mention from that video that I'm not going to be able to show you here is that when I first opened the palette, despite having a little piece of foam on top of the colors, there was little flakes of paint dust all over the inside of the palette. I do appreciate that Daniel Smith, like Da Vinci, did not wrap their individual pans, which doesn't produce any unnecessary waste. However, I do feel like the texture of Daniel Smith's paints and drying a little bit drier doesn't lend itself great to being out in the open during shipping like this. Since then, I have cleaned off the palette and we've done those first impression swatches, so this video is going to pick up after we've already done that. In today's video, I'm going to swatch these two palettes in a way that we can see how many of the color hues line up with each other. I will use the exact pigments or closest hue matches for most of the colors, and if a color doesn't have an equivalent, we'll go ahead and leave blank spaces next to them. Before we begin, I do want to give a quick shout out and thank you to my wonderful patron Natasha who sent this set to me so that we can make this video. I'm so grateful and thank you again so very much. We're going to first start off by simply swatching each of the colors, and then at the end of this video we will compare each side by side using a high resolution scan for more accurate color display. First up, only on the Daniel Smith side, we have buff titanium made from PW6:1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1 Next is Hansa Yellow Light PY3 versus R Light Yellow FGL PY97. Hansa Yellow Deep PY65 versus Hansa Yellow Deep PY65. For our warm reds, we have Pyrrole Scarlet PR255 versus Da Vinci Red PR254. For our dark, cool red, we have Permanent Alizarin Crimson from Daniel Smith, made from PR177, PV19, and PR149, versus Alizarin Crimson Quinacridone from Da Vinci using just PV19. On Da Vinci's palette, we have Perylene Maroon, made from PR179, Next, the magentas on our palette are made from Quinacridone Rose PV19 from Daniel Smith and Red Rose Deep PV19 from Da Vinci. On Da Vinci's palette, we have Da Vinci Violet, made from PV23, and Indanthrene Blue, made from PB60. Both palettes have Ultramarine Blue, made from PB29. For the lighter blue options in the palettes, Daniel Smith provides Cerulean Blue Chromium, made from PB36, while on my Da Vinci palette we have Cerulean Blue Hue, made from PB15 and PW6. For the cool blues on the palette, Daniel Smith has Phthalo Blue Green shade made from PB15:3, and the hue I chose is slightly different using Phthalo Turquoise PB16. On the Daniel Smith palette, we have Cobalt Turquoise made from PB36, followed by Phthalo Green Blue shade on both palettes made from PG7. Both palettes also have Perylene Green made from PBK31. Sap Green from Daniel Smith is made from PO48, PG7, and PY150, while Denise's Green from Da Vinci uses PY129 and PB60. The greens on the Daniel Smith palette are rounded out with Undersea Green, made from PB29, PO48, and PY150, while the Da Vinci palette is rounded out with Green Gold, made from PY129. Daniel Smith's palette also includes Raw Sienna Light, made from PY42, and next we have Quinacridone Gold from Daniel Smith, made from PO48 and PY150, versus Gold Ochre, made from PY42 and PY83 from Da Vinci. For our Earth Yellow, we have Yellow Ochre, PY43, versus Raw Sienna, made from PBR7. For a granulating, cool earth brown, we have Goethite Brown Ochre, made from PY43 from Daniel Smith, and Raw Sienna Deep, made from PY42 from Da Vinci. The next four colors are going to be head-to-head, same name and same pigment number, starting with Quinacridone Burnt Orange, PO48, Burnt Sienna, PBR7, Burnt Umber, PBR7, and Raw Umber, PBR7. Both palettes contain a color called Indian Red, though the hues differ slightly, so this version from Da Vinci I'm putting on a line by itself. It's made from PR101. Then we have Daniel Smith's Indian Red, also made from PR 101, but it more closely resembles the Violet Iron Oxide from Da Vinci, also made from PR 101. Finally, we have Jane's Gray from Daniel Smith, made from PB 29 and PBR 7. Now that the swatching is done, we can take a look at the high-resolution scans side by side. For the light yellows, Daniel Smith's version is cooler, while Da Vinci's version is more of a mid-tone yellow, though I would have really liked to see lemon yellow PY 175 on the Daniel Smith version of the palette. I think it's a nice crisp color that paints a little bit more cleanly than PY 3. For our warm yellow, they are both made from the same pigment and they paint out exactly the same way. On the Daniel Smith palette, we have Pyrrole Scarlet, which is a little bit more warm or oranger than Da Vinci Red, which leans more towards the middle of the road for reds. I personally don't use a lot of warm reds, so this isn't a big loss for me, but it might be for some people who are looking for a shade a little bit closer to orange. For our alizarin crimson hue, I much prefer Da Vinci's single pigment PV19, but if you guys have been around for the channel for a while, you know how much I love this hue. It is a little pinker in the tints than Daniel Smith's version, which remains a little bit more neutral. For our Quinacridone Rose, both companies offered the same pigment, and I was really impressed with Daniel Smith's version until I painted out the Da Vinci version, which does seem to be more pigmented overall. Moving to the blues, I think this is where we see the most differentiation in a standard color lineup. Both palettes include ultramarine made from PB29, but Da Vinci's is much more saturated, which is a theme overall on this palette. For the light blue, Daniel Smith offers a true cerulean blue, which is not part of the earth-friendly mission of my palette, while Da Vinci offers a hue that isn't made from this original pigment. I do prefer the granulation in the original version from Daniel Smith, and to be honest, if there was no question of sourcing the material, I would choose a cerulean for my palette as well. That being said, the cerulean blue hue is a perfectly acceptable alternative, although it does not granulate. For our cool blues, we have quite a differentiation where Daniel Smith offers the more typical phthalo blue-green shade, and I've opted for the phthalo turquoise made from PB16. I do feel like the PB16 offers more variety between the blues, and again, it's the one I use more often in my own work. For Phthalo Green, Daniel Smith's version has a little bit more of a blue undertone, while Da Vinci's is more middle of the road. I do think I prefer the underlying tones of the Daniel Smith version more, but the Phthalo Green from Da Vinci is more pigmented. I was really surprised to see the difference between the Pearlane Green, and this happened across multiple swatches and I tried multiple times. Daniel Smith's version has a granulation to it and it has a really uneven texture, while Da Vinci's version is incredibly smooth and very deeply valued. I drastically prefer Da Vinci's version. Next, we have Sap Green, which of course is a favorite of mine, and I love Daniel Smith's version. I set out to create a similar hue for Da Vinci that didn't use any nickel pigments, and that is what you'll see on the right-hand side. Daniel Smith's Sap Green is more vibrant and has more of a yellow undertone, while the Denise's green is a little bit more muted and earthy. One of my big concerns when I came out with my palette is that I was including too many earth yellows, which I love, but I wasn't sure that others would share that same passion for. Here we have 3 of them, but Daniel Smith actually included an extra earth pigment that we'll take a look at in a little bit. First up, we have Quinacridone Gold, which you know I love from Daniel Smith, and then we have Da Vinci's Gold Ochre. The Gold Ochre is a little bit more opaque and it's not quite as translucent as Quinacridone Gold, but the hues are very similar, especially if you add a touch of Quinacridone Burnt Orange to the Gold Ochre mix. Next isn't a direct color comparison, and you all know how much I adore Daniel Smith's Yellow Ochre, as it's very transparent and beautiful to use in animal paintings. The Yellow Ochre in Da Vinci's line was a little bit too opaque for my liking, so I opted for a Raw Sienna, which is admittedly a different hue, but would fill a similar type of niche on a palette. It is more brown and doesn't have quite as much granulation as the Daniel Smith version. Next we have 2 light cool earth browns. One being Goethite Brown Ochre from Daniel Smith, which has a medium brown tone with a darker brown granulation, and Da Vinci's version of Raw Sienna Deep that is more yellow and still has a medium brown granulation. While I don't love the hue of Raw Sienna Deep completely on its own as just a color, I find it invaluable in paintings, and I think that the unique hue of it would have different applications than the Goethite Brown Ochre. I've not used Goethite in many paintings, so I'll have to get back to you on that one. Finally, for the direct comparisons, we have all of our earth tones that are lined up pretty much identically. They all follow the same hues, though Da Vinci's versions tend to be more saturated and vibrant in general. I have had both burnt siennas on my main palette at different points, and I do find myself going back to Daniel Smith's for its soft, subtle granulation, but I'm going to give it to Da Vinci for the raw umber, which is loads more pigmented and easier to wet than the Daniel Smith variety. The Indian Red from Daniel Smith sits a little bit between Da Vinci's Indian Red and the Violet Iron Oxide, but is more close to this Violet Iron Oxide as I mentioned earlier. The Violet Iron Oxide has a little bit more granulation, and I like having the two colors split up rather than one median tone, but if you don't use either of these colors very often, I could see why Daniel Smith's would be desirable. So that's a total of 19 colors that line up pretty evenly from both palettes, so now we're going to take a look at the 5 differing colors from each lineup. In Daniel Smith's palette, we have this really light, earthy, urban, beachy feel to these extra colors. We've got buff titanium and cobalt turquoise, which definitely remind me of a beach, with undersea green and raw sienna light being very nature-based, and of course a nice neutral in Jane's gray. On my Da Vinci palette, we have more of a jewel tone focus with Perylene Maroon, Indanthrene Blue, Da Vinci Violet, Green Gold, and then we also have that Indian Red that I mentioned earlier. So what do I think about these two palettes overall? I've obviously spent a ton of time not only with my own palette painting, but also through the pigment selection process, so I know it pretty well inside and out. I love the color selections, so I can't be mad about seeing it represented in another brand, and I would have loved to see a palette like this from Daniel Smith when I was first starting off if one had existed at the time. So let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons to each. I think there is a good selection of reds covering a wider range of hues than I do on my Da Vinci palette, and the selections of blues is pretty standard, though I would have loved to see their new single pigment phthalo turquoise in place of the phthalo blue. I love the cerulean and cobalt turquoise colors, but those again are not necessarily earth-friendly, which is why my palette lacks similar pigments. The selection of greens is beautiful aside from the weird issue that I have with the Perylene Green, and they of course have gorgeous earth tones, and you can find a very standard array of them in this palette. I'm honestly surprised with how many earth yellows there are in this palette, since I thought my 3 was a lot and they have even more than that. I would definitely drop the raw sienna light and potentially even the buff titanium, though I know I don't use that, I know other people do, so I don't blame them for including it. I would have loved to see a Primatech color in the earth range like Pimentite Genuine thrown in here for a little something extra special for Daniel Smith. The set does lack any purples, though they have also released another palette at the same time called Colors of Inspiration that has a surplus of those types of hues, including Rose of Ultramarine and Moonglow, 2 colors that are really well represented by this brand. I think this is a really solid palette overall, and the metal tin is a huge improvement over the plastic boxes from last year. I would recommend this palette to artists who love reliable paints, granulating colors, and a wide array of earth tones. Daniel Smith, like Da Vinci, uses the same formula for tubes and pans, so if you already have the tubes and these colors, you can make your own palette as well. You don't have to buy this set, but if there are new colors in here and you love the brand anyway, I wouldn't hesitate picking it up. Denise's earth-friendly Da Vinci watercolor palette, of course, puts an emphasis on the earth-friendly portion of the name for artists who have similar criteria in their supplies. In addition to the wide array of earth tones, there are really bold and vibrant mixing colors that are steady and reliable. If there's anything that I would change about this palette a year after using it, I might replace the Perylene Maroon for either a Perylene Violet, a neutral tint made from PV19 and PG7, or a convenience gray made from burnt umber and ultramarine, as I find myself mixing those colors often while painting. I also, of course, have favorites from Daniel Smith, like Yellow Ochre, that I would be happy to include alongside my color selection, and if all of the colors were equally earth-friendly, I'd have opted for a true cerulean from Da Vinci's line as well. Otherwise, I have no complaints. I use my palette all the time and I'd recommend it to any artists who like colors that are a bit more bold and granulate a little bit less. Either way, I don't think you could go wrong with either palette depending on what is available in your area, what is cost effective, and what type of attributes you're looking for in your paints. Before I go, I will answer another question that I was asked a lot on Instagram, and just so that you have my answer here on YouTube. How do I feel about this personally? All I can say is that personally, as Denise the human, I'm a little bit sad. I'm sad that a brand that I've loved for so long, who I would have loved to work with, didn't reach out to me for something like this. But that's personal, it's not business. And as a business, I understand, and this type of thing happens all the time in the art world. I'm not the first person who's going to use this array of colors, and I won't be the last, but I'm glad they're out there in the world existing for others to use them. While I have always loved the granulation of Daniel Smith paints and will continue to use them, I love Da Vinci as a company through and through. They make wonderful, high-quality, affordable products and are deeply supportive of their artist community. I am so immensely grateful to have had the opportunity to work with them. None of this is paid by either company. This isn't a sponsored video. I, of course, work with Da Vinci and I'm invested in them both personally and as a business person, but I genuinely believe everything that I've told you in this video, and I hope that you can see through my objective comparisons that I will always tell you my thoughts on any given art supply. I hope this video was helpful to all of you who are deciding between these two palettes or interested in looking at this new one, particularly from Daniel Smith, and I think that just about does it. By the time this video comes out, I am going to be up to my elbows in a local move, if you missed that in my last video announcement. I'm hoping to have one more video already prepared for you while I am moving, but otherwise I will see you guys in April. So until then, everyone, happy painting.